It's time for Pure Performance.
Get your stopwatches ready. It's time for Pure Performance with Andy Grabner and Brian Wilson. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Pure Performance. My name is Brian Wilson, and as always, I have my lovely, beautiful, and talented co-host, Andy Grabner, with me today. Andy, how are you doing today? Are you feeling lovely, talented, and beautiful?
Well, I thought it's handsome for male, isn't it? I mean, I'm not the native speaker in English, but isn't that the way it works?
I'm stealing English back for myself. Okay. I make the rules here. I'm an American. Okay. I make the rules. It's okay.
Yeah, you learned something. Okay. No, everything is good here, and I think it's my second or third podcast recording now with the new microphone, and I hope people hear the difference.
I approve, and I'm sure it's a bit of an easier setup for you than having to have those power sources and all that. So, for anybody who's into the audio stuff, Andy was using a Zoom, the H2N Zoom microphone, which is great for field recording, but as a sort of home-based record mic, it's a bit cumbersome because it's got batteries and all the other stuff. So what do you have now anyway?
I got a Razer. A Razer.
Who makes that? Is that Motorola?
I think it's Razer. I don't know. No, I think the brand is Razer, and whatever it's called. I don't even know what it's called. I just installed it, plugged it in, and it worked.
I'll have to search it later.
Yeah. It was sent to me by. Thanks and a shout out to our lovely colleagues from the Dynatrace marketing team for recording the Dynatrace Go sessions. We got sent some better equipment, a better camera, and also a better microphone. So that's what I'm using now.
Oh, I wonder if that's what I saw Alois the other day. He was actually shopping for a microphone because he was having some issues, and. No, it wasn't Alois. It was Michael Kopp in our training. And his camera looked phenomenal. I was like, holy cow. I bet you it's because of that. That's awesome. I need to find out what that is because that might be nice to have. Anyhow, we're talking about tech gear. Everyone's working from home. So, things to do to improve your sound or your video on those remote meetings definitely helps, I think. So I don't think this is a completely wasted conversation as intro. But since we've been wasting time, we have I forget the poet, but there was "Oh, Captain, my Captain," right? That's an old famous line from an old famous poem that I can't recall. Obviously, English poem, but or American. But anyway, I'm rambling today, Andy. Save me.
Yeah, sure, I'll save you. Well, as you said, normally you scold me for using Keptn too often in a podcast, but I think today it's allowed to use it a couple of more times than usual. We actually got two of the core team members of the Keptn team with us today. And the reason why we brought them up, well, this is something you will hear later. But before we get started, let's just give them a chance to introduce themselves. It's Johannes and Andreas. So my first question to you, very, very straightforward. Who are you guys? And you may want to start with maybe Johannes is the first and then Andreas. Who are you?
Hi, Brian and Andy. Many thanks for this invite. I'm Johannes. I'm main maintainer of the Keptn project, and I'm also working in the innovation lab of Dynatrace now for 2 years. And it's a lot of fun working here and enjoying every minute I'm in the office and I'm working for the innovation lab.
Cool.
Thank you.
Hi, also from my side. I'm Andreas Grimmer, and I'm also working for Dynatrace for now about 1.5 years. And I'm also looking forward to share some of my learnings at this time working on an open source project.
Perfect. And folks that may have read the abstract to the podcast, you probably saw the similariness between our two names, Andreas Grabner and Andreas Grimmer. So in case you ever write us an email or find us online, it's also odd for us to have names that are that close. Even the last name is very close. The way we typically kind of get ourselves apart or kind of differentiate ourselves is with the first name pronunciation. So Andreas goes with Andreas and I go with Andy. So in case you ever come across us, that's the way we make sure we address the right person.
I thought it would always be if you two are together, you two would have to both salsa dance, and then we'd be able to tell which one's Andy and which one's Andreas. Because Andreas, I'm just assuming you're not a salsa dancer like Andy, and if you are, you're not the same caliber. But anyway.
That's true.
And hey, I just want to point out, you two have been talking about how long you've been with Dynatrace, and the only reason I bring it up is because it's end of September. This Andy Grabner, this marks 9 years for me, which I think is about, you're a little longer than that, I think, right?
I got 12 and a
or
half,
about
yeah.
the same. 12, yeah. A little, 3, yeah. Anyhow, and I love working here too. It's awesome. Anyhow, I just wanted to point that out.
So for the audience, the reason why we got these two guys on board is obviously we will talk a little bit about Keptn, but the initial thought was to really talk with a group that has been, in the Kubernetes space now with a project, with a service, with an application for a year and a half. And we really wanted to talk a lot about the learnings. What have you learned? What have you done in the beginning? What made you make certain decisions? Which decisions would you have made differently looking back? Because we know a lot of organizations are investing in Kubernetes. They're starting to build applications. And I think we see there's a lot of learnings, and I think we have our learnings, and that's why we want to share those. So,
and Andy, I also want to, I'm interrupting you all the time today. I think this also ties back to, there was a podcast we did a while ago about lessons learned or things to learn and consider when trying to go for open source. And I think, reading over the notes of this, some of this can apply for that as well, because obviously besides the work it's doing with Keptn and all those considerations, seeing some of the challenges that have gone into this that we'll reveal during the episode of considerations of the whole open source things and how sometimes you do have to change things and you're like, okay, we got this far, but now we know we got to go back and make a major change in order to keep it going forward. Keep in mind, for anyone working on open source project, there's some other good notes in here for that as well, I believe.
Yeah, but maybe Johannes, as you introduce yourself as kind of the core, one of the core maintainers, can you kind of take us back a year and a half ago about when this all started? How did you start and why Kubernetes and what are the initial lessons learned?
Absolutely. Because I think it's important to understand how everything started so that we can also then better explain our learnings that we had along our journey. And for answering this question, I think we have to go back in time because it happened 2 years ago that we in the innovation lab, we had the goal to bootstrap a workshop that helps our customers and partners to deal with the complexity and with the challenges that come with the cloud. As you all might know, Dynatrace is a SaaS company, and of our own journey to move workload from on-prem to the cloud, we also learned a lot of things. We developed best practices. We applied certain strategies and best and learnings, and those we also wanted to deliver to customers. For example, we collected all the best practices around automating the monitoring, about performance testing, then also setting up quality standards for your delivery, and also applying deployment strategies. And this we all bundled into a workshop, and then we delivered this workshop to participants that were joining a workshop. And the outcome was always great, because at the end of such a workshop, the participants, they were really amazed by what we showed them, because we had hands-on labs, then small demos, and they could really feel how it works to deal with cloud tasks. And at the end, they all were very motivated to also integrate those components into their own organization. But after a couple of weeks, they came then back to us and said, well, we wanted to get started. We wanted to set up performance testing. We wanted to set up quality gates in our pipelines, but we are missing a very central component, a component that helps us to get started. And this was then, the kickoff of the Keptn project, because with the Keptn project, we announced, or we still are working on a framework for automating continuous deployment tasks and also going beyond deployment and helping to automate operations. And this was then, the kickoff. This happened in January 2019. And since then, we are constantly improving and evolving the Keptn project. Yeah, this was
Very cool.
now, the intro and what happened 2 years ago.
Yeah, and I think it's great that you bring us back, because I also remember, I think it was in the hotel? What was it called again? Next to our office? Donauwelle, right? I think that's what.
Yeah,
I think it was
in the
Donauwelle, if I remember.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm.
And we had all the folks together, and we were basically using Jenkins for automating a couple of tasks. Then we were, as you said, putting things together, and then say, well, this works great with our sample app, and now we know the best practices and how it can look like. And you're completely right. Then basically, when we said, now let's implement this, then we said, yes, it worked well for the demo app, but how can we get this on the road for real, right? How can we build something that actually works for everyone out there, not just for the sample app that we picked? Yeah.
True. Yeah.
Cool.
Right.
So the next question that I have, and I think this is also important to understand, because as you said, Johannes, in order for the listeners to understand why we made certain decisions or why you made certain decisions, it's also important to understand what the product, what the tool is all about. Maybe Andreas, kicking it over to you. While Johannes has already addressed or covered a little bit of the use cases, can you go a little bit deeper into what the use cases are that you guys are addressing?
Sure. Yeah. So as Johannes explained, Keptn addresses two use cases, namely the deployment, the testing and evaluation of artifacts, as well as their operation tasks and automating this. So Keptn now provides you a framework in order to implement this. And unfortunately, you do not have to start from scratch here. Instead, Keptn gives you lots of best practices which are already built in. For example, one of our best practice is the so-called quality gate. And this quality gate allows you to evaluate the quality of your microservices in a fully automatic way. So therefore, we are using well-known concepts like service level indicators and service level objectives. And these service level indicators can now be any metric which you get from your monitoring solution, like Prometheus, Dynatrace, you name it. And using the service level indicators, you can then formulate service level objectives. And basically using these objectives, we can then build a quality gate. So this is really now one best practice which is built into Keptn. And then we can use this result of the quality gate, for example, in order to decide whether an artifact should be promoted into production or not.
Very cool. And Andreas, thanks for that explanation. I think obviously for me, this should be nothing new because we're working very closely on this, and the concept of the SLI providers of pulling data in from different data sources, I think is also what attracts a lot of people to Keptn, because Keptn as an open source project is agnostic to the underlying data source. And I really like the fact that you kind of architecture it in a way that you can easily replace components such as the data source. And I want to just also do a quick shout out for people that want to learn how to build their own SLI data source. I'm giving a talk at the Neotis PAC event that happens early October. By the time this show airs, I think it's probably around the same time. But anyway, the recording should be out there. I'm actually going through the use case on how to write your own SLI provider, because we have seen users out there that were asking, so how can I pull in data from Splunk? How can I pull it in? I think Wavefront Intuit is building an integration there. How can I pull data in from other APM tools? And so I want to show how this works.
Hey, Andy Grabner, can I ask you a question about that?
Of course.
I think it's all related. So one of the things I've noticed in Keptn, and I have very limited use of it, but usually we're saying a data source, pull from Dynatrace. Now, Keptn can pull from multiple data sources, right? So the idea, the benefit of what you're describing is that you can pull some metrics all within the same test. You'll be able to pull metrics from multiple data sources to do your evaluation. Is that true?
So right now, and guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but right now we have a kind of one-to-one relationship from a Keptn project to a data source. So that means you can set up different projects and then have the, for every project, a different data source. You can say, I'm running one for my monitoring data and then one for my testing data. So this is one way of doing it. The plan is to support in the future multiple SLI providers for the same project. But for this, I don't want to go too far out and promise too many things. This is where I hand it back to Andreas and Johannes to see where we're standing with these multiple SLI providers.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Andy. For pulling in data from different sources, you have to split those based on projects. That is what you can use as of today. But plans are going forward, and we want to also include other sources into the same testing process and the evaluation process.
And I think the reason, and again, Johannes, correct me if I'm wrong, why we've been kind of dragging out these capabilities, because what we have seen is that a lot of organizations do have a data source where a lot of data ends up anyway. So with our Dynatrace customers, they're pushing all the data into Dynatrace first, and then you can get this data out. Like we were doing a lot of work with the Neotis folks. They have their own SLI provider, yet they're also pushing data to Dynatrace. So that means through the Dynatrace SLI provider, you can get out all this data. Or Sumit from Intuit, right? They are pushing all the data into Weaveworks, Wavefront, and then they're pulling the data from there. This is why we've also kind of dragged out the decision to focus on this feature earlier and focus on other things first.
It does make sense too, because if the idea of putting all of your data in one source makes a lot of sense for maintenance and cleanliness and all that. So yeah, good points. Just curious there. Thanks.
Yeah. So got a follow-up question here, and I think this also brings us even more closer to some of the decisions you made. But we talked, and Andreas explained the use cases, explained the SLIs and SLOs. I talked about the openness. How does Keptn actually work then? Maybe this is a question for Johannes probably. How does it work? How can you actually, and I think this is what we're promoting, separate the concerns between process definition and tool definition? How does this all work internally? And why is it so flexible that you can actually extend Keptn as you like?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because in its core, Keptn is an event-based or follows an event-based architecture. This means that Keptn itself receives events from the outside, then it analyzes this event and then kicks off a process like the delivery or like remediation. And then Keptn takes care of orchestrating all these events that then are also sent out by Keptn and received by Keptn. And this is a way that that other tools can be plugged in, because they just have to listen to certain events, and whenever they receive it, they do their job, and then they just respond with a finished event. And this is then the trigger for Keptn to go on and to do the next orchestration step. I mean, I always bring this the example of the continuous delivery pipeline when I explain the event-based approach of Keptn, because as you know, continuous delivery has always testing in mind. And when you kick off a delivery process, then Keptn will at some point send out a test.triggered event. This will then be picked up by a tool like JMeter, Selenium, or any other testing tool. Then the tool does its job, and when it's done, it just responds with the test.finished. And finally, Keptn then goes on and executes, or takes care of executing the next step in the delivery process. And bringing this flexibility allows customers to also plug in their tools they have already in their organization and in their operational or development processes. And this is great flexibility that comes with Keptn. And maybe just one additional thought for understanding how Keptn is working. From a technical perspective, we split Keptn into two components. One we call the control plane, which is taking care of all the eventing mechanism. And the other one is the execution plane that is then responsible for executing the tasks, like testing, like the quality evaluation, like doing a remediation action. And as of today, both planes are running on Kubernetes, but we are planning and already implementing features to also let the execution plane run outside of Kubernetes. But yeah, as of today, Kubernetes is the underlying platform that Keptn is running on.
Very cool. Hey, Johannes, I got a question here. So the way, or maybe a confirmation, because the way I always try to explain it, basically what you just explained to me is we bring a concept into continuous delivery that we have seen from architects that designing modern applications. That means you have loosely coupled components. You call them the execution plane, right? Loosely coupled services, and they all talk to each other through events. And there's obviously one component that makes sure that the right events are sent at the right time. It's like a business process engine that is executing, that is orchestrating a process by sending the right events at the right time. And then you have, loosely coupled things that can also be replaced very easily that can then actually do a task. Do I understand
absolutely
this right?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely correct. Also important to know or to understand is that Keptn follows the principle of separating the process, which can be a delivery process or a remediation process, from the actual tooling, so that you can easily plug in different tools depending on your ecosystem and also on the tools that the cloud provider offers you.
Very cool. Now, so I think we talked a lot about the use cases, how Keptn is working. So I think by now, if listeners, if you're still here, you should hopefully understand what Keptn does. And if not, then we really need to figure out what we do wrong with explaining it. There's a lot of other material out there too. If you want to catch up, there's videos, there's tutorials. You can go to tutorials, keptn.sh. And as we said, we have a YouTube channel with a lot of additional information. But now let's really get into things that, like, lessons learned. I want to really understand how did we get from where we started after we left that room in that hotel, from where we had a demo environment to where we are now. Like, how do we get started? What did we, because it's a big problem that we obviously had to solve. And I guess we had different, we call it Baustellen in German. We had different construction sites, different things that we had to attack. So maybe Andreas, I think it's time for you again. What are the steps that we take back then and lessons learned?
Yeah, I can confirm that this is definitely a long way from being a demo until there is we are a project. So I especially like now to explain you our installer, because this installer always really nicely describes the maturity of the project of Keptn. So we started, of course, with a bunch of shell scripts, as everyone does. So this shell script has been executed by the users locally, and as you can imagine, we run in lots of problems. So we had lots of dependencies on external tools at specific versions and so on. And if such a tool was not available, our demo did not work. So basically, this was the first generation of Keptn 0.1, a bunch of shell scripts. In the second generation, we thought this is no way, we have to do something against it. So we containerized basically the complete installer. So we got a Docker image, which was then executed by a Kubernetes job. And this Kubernetes job basically sets up our complete demo environment. And this fully automatic installation was great for doing demos, because we automatically installed Helm with Tilda, because Helm version 3 was not available. We installed Istio, we installed Knative, and we even set up some virtual services and gateways in order to access our UI and also the API. Yeah, but as I said, we had lots of dependencies, and you can imagine not every Keptn user really would like, for example, to have Istio installed. So this kicked basically off our third generation. And here we basically did a radical diet of the installer. So we sat down, did a re-evaluation of our dependencies. And for example, let's pick now Knative. So in the first place, Knative looked like a really nice match to Keptn because Knative eventing was the perfect tool in order to manage, subscribe, and also deliver our Keptn events. Also, Knative serving was really cool because this would even allow us to scale our services down to 0 and to save resources. However, we found out that Knative was definitely not the right choice for us. First of all, it took so much resources that we, for example, needed 16 virtual CPUs for only doing a demo setup. And honestly, Knative was also too unstable at this time because we always make the joke that we spend much more time debugging Knative than Keptn itself. So my learning here is definitely do an in-depth research of your dependencies, and especially if you're using dependencies which have a version below 1.0. So really be careful here. And I can continue now the story. So we even were able to remove Istio. We were able to remove Tiller because Helm 3 was there. And basically we resulted in an installer which only consists of a single Helm chart. And this Helm chart now allows the user to configure, for example, the services, how the API is exposed. And this was a great move, which we did last year.
Mm-hmm. So Andreas, a quick question here, a recap, because I think you just said a lot of interesting things that I also vividly remembered as we went through that kind of progress of maturing. A lot of people will run into the same thing. So the first I like the installer story, because the first time we tried to install everything through shell script from the outside and basically installing things probably using kubectl commands that we basically put together in shell scripts, right? It was all kubectl and doing this and this, and it was like probably very lengthy shell scripts.
That's true.
That's true, right? The next thing, instead of doing it from the outside, we baked it into a container and then let that container run from within the Kubernetes cluster to avoid, obviously problems with being not able to execute shell scripts correctly. And then we basically put this into an installer job. But then the other thing that I thought was very fantastic, and I want to make sure that people don't think we are bashing on projects that are not in version 1.0 yet, because remember, guys, Keptn is also still in 0.0, in 0. something. But there's obviously a price, quote unquote, to pay if you are jumping on a new technology or framework early on, and you are playing also, tester in most of the cases, and that's what we did with Knative, and I'm pretty sure Knative now is matured and is a great framework for use cases where it really makes sense, right? I think that's what I wanted to say. And
yeah, I'd add to that, Andy, because I used to play with Keptn in some of the earlier days, and it's funny that you mentioned the bit with Tiller and Knative, because I remember going through some of the exercises, and especially once I got to the Tiller part, there would always be some error going through, and I'd start looking up what my environment had wrong, if there was a permission, and I remember in the earlier days thinking, like, how is this going to be usable if this is happening? And you're describing exactly, you just described exactly what happened to me, is what you all discovered and said, well, it's because of these dependencies. Let's get rid of these dependencies. And I think that just is a very strong action to take, to say, this is just not going to work this way. Let's change it now while we can. Mm-hmm. And you have to make those decisions, which sometimes can be tough because you look at, I don't know how much work was involved in that decision, but you'll come to the point where you say, either we're going to keep having these kinds of issues, or we put in the work now and save on it later. So kudos to that.
Mm-hmm. All right, Andreas, sorry that I interrupted you, but I think you wanted to go on with some other stuff.
No, I think the installer really shows how to get, or how we got from a demo setup to a project setup. So there are so many steps which you have to take to evaluate your dependencies, and also, of course, you need to get your features made sure.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to then touch on one more thing, though, because I know in which state we are right now. So as of the time of the recording, we have version 0.71 released. You just mentioned we provide the Helm option to install Keptn for people, especially that I think we have a couple of customer or users that are using that are in air-gapped systems where they want to first download all the images and then they want to use Helm to deploy it after they vetted and analyzed all the images. I think that's great. But I also want to bring up one thing, and I want to get your kind of public opinion on this. We've reduced complexity on our end, as you said, by only installing things that are really necessary to Keptn. We don't install Istio anymore by default. We don't configure virtual services. So we basically leave this to the end user depending on how they want to use Keptn, because we assume if they want to use, if they want to do blue-green deployments with Keptn, then they may already have Istio. We use it. They can decide how to expose Keptn to the outside world because they already have an ingress. Now, the point that I want to make here, while we made all these steps, we assumed, or we kind of pushed the responsibility of the things around Keptn, everything that is necessary for something to run in Kubernetes and to be exposed to the outside world. We kind of pushed this away from us, and we assumed that our users know about these things and they can provide these things and they know how to work. But the reality, at least for me, it seems that we see a lot of people just getting started with Kubernetes, and now they're struggling also with these, let's say, quote unquote, basic concepts that we have assumed people know, right? I think wanted to hear your thoughts on this. If maybe I just see this because I work with a couple of users, or if you also see this.
Yes, I would say we have sharpened the focus of Keptn. So Keptn shouldn't be the tool, for example, which manages your certificates. So yes, I completely agree that this challenge is now pushed basically to our users. But I also think that this is the right place where this should live. So in the management of the certificates. Before we've used, for example, Istio in order to expose services. And as you can imagine, a framework like Istio also brings lots of complexity into it. So going back and using Kubernetes primitives like services with a load balancer, node port, or using an Kubernetes ingress is sometimes easier than using Istio with gateways and virtual services. So, yes, but of course we also provide some quick starts how to set your production environment up with Keptn. So I wouldn't say that the user is now alone. So there is always help from our side. But maybe this is a little bit more in the documentation now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I bring in one learning from my end? Because it also relates to this question or to this discussion. Because I think you can never make assumptions about the environment you will be deployed on. This was also one thing that we had in our first version of the installer, and also in the second generation. We made too many assumptions about the environment that we deploy Keptn on, and we also learned that this is not true, and this is not the case that we can assume this or that. It always depends on the user, and also on the setup the user has then available. because there is, for example, the OpenShift group. Then there is the group that has an air-gapped system where you have no internet connectivity to the outside world. And then there is the group of the users that have access to a regular Kubernetes deployment, like in a G Cloud or an AWS. And there is that much difference between those groups that you never can make any assumption about the environment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Never make assumption in which environment you end up running. And also I think one additional point that I want to make, because, a year, to be honest with everybody out there, to be frank, I had no clue about Kubernetes a year ago, and I'm still struggling with a lot of basic concepts because I simply I was never trained on, even though I have a basic understanding of networking, but I'm completely blank when it comes to, routing and certificates. This is just something that is definitely not my stronghold. But now, if I want to go towards Kubernetes, and whether this is Keptn or anything else, I believe the big lessons learned for me as a consumer, as a user of the Kubernetes ecosystem, is that I need to be aware of these things, because I'm all of a sudden, I think, responsible for it, unless I work for an organization where they provide Kubernetes as a service to me. But then most likely this Kubernetes is so locked down or so special that it's again hard to get specific software in. So I think the lesson learned for me is learn. You need to understand Kubernetes, and that also includes networking, routing, security. I think we all need to have a basic understanding, because otherwise it does a lot of struggle on any side here. All right, that was my little thing, my advice and lessons learned from my side.
You sounded like me there for a moment, Andy.
I know.
Right?
I'm completely. I mean, Kubernetes is amazing, and I think it opens so many doors. But I think we also need to understand that. Brian, I think we both come from the Windows background. Just because I know how to launch Windows 10 and know how to open PowerShell doesn't mean I know how to properly operate a Kubernetes cluster.
I installed Windows 2000 from diskette, from 3.5-inch disk. So, that puts me in another class. So,
So I think, guys, great lessons learned. And I know there's a lot of, different venues. As you said, there's a lot of stuff in the documentation where we help guide people through things that they need to know and need to install. Now, shifting a little bit to a different area, there was a strategic decision, I assume, to make Keptn an open source project. And I was wondering how does this all work out with an open source project? Is this more beneficial in the end or is it worth the effort going down the open source route? Is it slowing you down because there's certain things and processes in place? What are the lessons learned from actually running an open source project? And in this particular case, a CNCF sandbox project.
I can get started. I think the first really cool thing is that the community of Keptn not only exists of the core developers, because there are also the users out there. The users that try out Keptn, that find a bug and report the bug, and they also bring in new ideas for features and enhancements. And this is really what makes working for an open source project fun and very, very cool. I think this is one learning from my end. Bringing the actual user, closer to the product is definitely a positive aspect of running it as an open source project.
Very cool. Yeah. Any other thoughts, Andreas? Maybe from an open source perspective.
So Keptn is intentionally designed to be an open system which allows custom integrations. And few minutes ago, we talked about SLI providers. So we have one for Dynatrace, we have one for Prometheus, but now the community of Keptn is building an SLI provider for vFront and other tools. And this really allows us to scale Keptn. Otherwise, when we wouldn't be an open source project, it would simply be impossible to do every SLI provider on our own. So I see great benefits in providing a great ecosystem which addresses then lots of use cases. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also remember I had actually a call earlier this morning with a user, and he was struggling with a Dynatrace SLI integration that where I wrote the code for. And he said, you know what, I pinged you earlier because I wanted to get some help. And we went on the call, and then he said, you know what, I just looked up the source code because it's available anyway. And so I found my way around. I understand now how it works. So I think this is also great of having this open out there, open and flat out there, and people can just, if they are not afraid of code, of looking at other people's code, also help themselves or build integrations, as you said. Yeah.
I totally agree. And I had the same story in my mind, that really users are pointing you to a source code, a line of source code that is containing a bug. And then it's really an easy game to fix the bug and to deliver a new feature. And this would not be possible in a closed source product. And yeah, this helps in engaging with the users, and also the users to engage with the Keptn team. It's a thing. I think it's a win-win situation for both the users and the developers of Keptn.
So great stories, but I didn't know that there are bugs in our source code.
I think with a colleague who calls them opportunities. Right? There's a lot of opportunities in our source code to make it better. Exactly.
Wow, that's some serious HR type action there.
I know.
It's called an opportunity instead of, no, it's an opportunity. Wow. You're going to have to remember that one.
Yeah. Hey, I know we've been doing this or you guys have been doing this for a year and a half, and we've been, since when, do you remind me, since when have you been engaged with CNCF?
Engaged with CNCF? We kicked off the start in August 2019.
Mm-hmm.
There we started to write our proposal for CNCF. It was in August last year. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. And then I think earlier this summer, or maybe in the spring, we got officially accepted as a sandbox project, I believe.
True. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. And now we are on the road to what's the next step? Incubation, I think, is the next
incubation.
Kind of level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, one question, and this, I think, Brian, with whom did we discuss open source projects and kind of how to run them and lessons learned? We had, I think
that's a good question.
She was from Google, I believe. Yeah, I think she was from Google, and she talked about open source projects. Now, right. I know that both of you and also the rest of the team is not only active in our own Keptn community, but I believe, Andreas, you are also a part of the CDF, right? You're actively an active member of the Continuous Delivery Foundation. How does that go?
Right. This is a similar organization like CNCF, and I'm also member of a special interest group on interoperability, and this is now a perfect match of Keptn, because Keptn really tries to address these interoperability problems using events, and therefore I'm here a member in this group. And for example, we are currently working on a white paper which really states the advantages of using event-based systems also for continuous delivery.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. And I think the reason why I wanted to bring it up, I believe this is also very important, that when you are running an open source project and you hope for external contributors, which, obviously is one of our goals in order to grow an ecosystem, you need to have external contributors. But I think you also need to give back and kind of contribute to other communities. And this is why I wanted to highlight that you are part of the CDF, and that has obviously benefited the CDF. It has also already benefited us because they gave us a podcast. We're now speaking at the conference, and we are in constant exchange. So I think as a best practice, for everybody out there that wants to start, don't just think about your own open source project, but if you want to make it big, also contribute to others, because in the end, it's a global community, and we need to kind of cross-pollinate, or whatever you want to call this. I'm not sure what the right word is for that. The one other topic, staying on this with how to grow an open source project. We do have open or external contributors, right? There's a couple of people that have contributed already.
Mm-hmm. True. Yep. We have a couple of folks out there that provide contributions almost on a weekly basis.
Mm-hmm. And I know there was, and maybe you can, Imre, I think he was great, because I think his story, and maybe you can even tell this better than I can, the way he started with Keptn and why.
Yeah, he took a look at our issues, and we have a couple of those marked as good first issues. Those are issues that we consider as good, as candidates for getting started and for getting involved into the dev process of Keptn. And he picked one of those. He assigned himself to the issue, got it implemented, and then he filed a PR and opened a PR against the Keptn core code base, and we approved it, and then he was in. He was then, this was his first contribution, and he then continued to provide other features as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's cool, because I remember I had a conversation with him, and I think he said he wanted to get into the open source space. He wanted to contribute, but then he looked at Kubernetes as a project, and he said it's so huge, and he didn't really know, and should he contribute a README change? But then he said no, he wants to actually contribute some code. So he was actually looking in a space that is interesting for him, which is the space we are in with Keptn. But he also picked a smaller project where it was easier to contribute also code, and I think he was really helpful, or he was really happy with the way we kind of onboarded him on the community, the way he felt. So that was great, because I think we exchanged some thoughts on the podcast that I recorded with him, because he's also running a podcast in Indonesia, where he's from. That was pretty cool. Andreas and Johannes, did we, to kind of round up the open source project discussion, is there anything else that we have learned over the last year or so, since we have been pushing this open source project, especially around CNCF? Are there any things that people that want to actually start maybe their own CNCF project that they should be aware of? Things that we didn't anticipate in the beginning, some challenges, some things they require from us, just hurdles, or maybe even things that people should know, that these are things that they will have to do if they want to become a CNCF project.
Mm-hmm. And that's one thing that also we had to learn. It's all about documentation first. You need to describe what you want to implement by your issue. You also need to describe what's on the roadmap, and you need to provide documentation to make it even possible for someone to contribute. And when I think back, 1 year ago, our issues, there was a one-liner in there, just explaining what needs to be done. And now they are really nice, framed, where we have an explanation, what's the problem, what's the task, what's the different definition of done. And this then allows other people and also contributors to understand what needs to be implemented. Long story short, documentation first is definitely a learning that you have to follow, or you have to apply when it comes to an open source project.
Anything else from you, Andreas? Any things that is good? Is it good to know if you go down the route of an open source project that you learned?
So I only can confirm, Johannes, because you really have to learn that every communication is asynchronously. So it would be best to don't talk to each other, instead to write your thoughts on the GitHub issue. We all know that this is lots of work, and sometimes it's easier to discuss this directly. But otherwise, when you you write it down, it really gets transparent for everybody. And then you can really see how decisions are made, and you can influence the decisions, which is really interesting. And this was definitely a learning from my side, that we have to keep the documentation up to date and keep transparency.
Mm-hmm. So that means what you just described is a new opportunity for a new open source project that is transcribing Zoom conversations or whatever thing, and then automatically putting comments on pull requests or issues with the right username attached to it. I mean, that would be awesome, wouldn't it? Because then you can have a conversation like we have, but everything is fully documented in Git.
Yeah, but then you got to watch what you say.
It's true.
That stupid Andy wanted me to put this thing in here, and now oops, I didn't. I meant Grimmer, not
yeah. Yeah. No, but that's thought. Yeah.
It's an interesting point too, because for so long there's been the idea that you have to get all developers together in a room, right? That working. I think especially pre-COVID, there was this idea that working remote in certain situations, especially with development teams, can be detrimental because they can't just get together and whiteboard things and hash things out. And obviously we're seeing that's not so much the case if you have, good people in COVID. But I think that almost takes the idea of it all going, like, it's taking it one step further, where the lesson from the distributed team that you're working with in an open source project is to say, no, don't have a conversation with them. Go even further away from getting in the room and just type it all out, which it sounds so counterintuitive, or at least it's so different from what was being said a year ago or 2 years ago in terms of everyone has to be in the same room and hash out ideas, that putting it into words, typing it out there, making it visible for all to see, and sort of maybe not necessarily slowing down the process, but removing from the process the idea of communication, one-to-one direct communication is really interesting. And I don't know how to account for that, if it's applicable more widespread than just an open source kind of GitHub situation or not. So it's kind of opening a new, idea here.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, if you are, first of all, you take, even though there are obviously emojis and exclamation points, but typically you probably take the emotion out of this of conversations, and therefore really have to think of what you want to write and in a way that people understand. And I think, I'm sure we've all been in that situation. If you want to say something right now, but then you kind of take a step back and wait a minute or two and then start writing it down, then the stuff that you write down actually makes often more sense and is clearer. So I like that. But it's obviously a big change to the way we as humans have done collaboration together, right? Especially in times when we've all been in offices.
Yeah. I think also there's this idea everyone falls in love with, and I have no idea how true it is, but there's the idea of the eureka moment where someone goes, aha, right? Mm-hmm. If you and I are having a conversation and brainstorming an idea, logically it would seem that we would have a lot more opportunities for those aha, those eureka moments, as opposed to if I'm calmly writing down something in an email, then you're reading it, thinking about it, reacting to it. There doesn't, that chemical interaction that occurs when people are in the same room. I think our bodies even just undergo a change when you're in the same room, and who knows if that process makes the thinking process different. Do breakthroughs not happen, or are they more likely to happen? That's a research project for somebody out there. Are breakthroughs more likely to happen if people are reading well-written, concise things that they can ponder on and think on before writing? Or how much does one-to-one interaction in presence of others, how many times does that actually spawn a useful eureka or aha moment? So if someone's looking for a thesis paper, go ahead and run with that one.
Hey, Brian, I don't want to do a summarator today because I think
maybe the summarator's going on retirement for a while.
It seems so.
It's been a while.
I wonder, because guys, typically I'll try to summarize the things that I've learned, but I think I always kind of recapped on what you guys have been saying in different sections of the podcast. I want to
Agile recap.
That's a recap, yeah. Agile recap, exactly. But the thing that I want to ask each of you individually, and I want to start with Johannes, looking back 1.5 years, if you would start over now from scratch, where we were when we left that room, with all the knowledge you have about Kubernetes, about open source projects, what would you do differently now? How would you change the architecture? Again, would you pick different frameworks for certain things? Would you still pick Kubernetes or pick something else, or any other thing that one thing that comes to mind that you would change and would do differently? Johannes.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. First of all, I think I would still use Kubernetes as the container orchestration framework for deploying and running our framework. But one thing that I would now do different is that I would reevaluate each and every dependency you bring in, because each dependency you need to update. They have security vulnerabilities you need to be aware of, and also force an update. Mm-hmm. And at the end, each dependency also has a customer impact. And therefore, you really need to reconsider what you bring into your product. And maybe from an not technical point of view, but more from an product point of view, I mean, we had great possibilities to talk to customers in an early stage, but I would also bring in customers into the kind of brainstorming and decision-making phase right at the beginning, because at the end you want to solve a customer problem or a user problem, and those problems must be written down on a whiteboard right at the beginning when you start working on a project on a project that solves a problem.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Andreas, anything from your end?
Yeah, I would also go with Kubernetes, but probably some types we are using, so some resources, for example, our shipyard file could be, for example, be a custom resource in Kubernetes. So using operators in order to control this life cycle of these resources. Maybe this would be a good design decision, and maybe we will do it. But we, of course, had the decision to not make us dependent from Kubernetes. So Keptn should run anywhere, and that was the reason why we stick to this architecture. And yeah, there are lots of small issues. For example, introducing health checks, resource limits, rule-based access controls. You all have to do this from the beginning. Basically, do the design with security in mind from the first place. This is really a learning, and if we would now restart again, I would definitely have this more considered.
That's a very good advice. So I think both of you. So if I want to do a little highlight of what the both of you just said, is always figure out what is the real problem is that you really want to solve by talking with people that actually have the problem, and doing this in a large enough group that you're actually solving a problem, not for one individual, but for a larger group of people for a product. Not that we haven't done it, but we should have included even more people up front. And then if you stick to Kubernetes, which both of you agree on was a good decision, is always have the security aspect in mind, which I know is basically the earlier you address it, the easier it will become, and you don't have all the technical debt, security debt, whatever you want to call it, to deal with later on. I think that's great advice from both of you. Brian, what have you learned today?
Well, I learned a lot about Kubernetes that I hadn't thought of before. I learned about the history, which was really awesome. And I think what our listeners can learn is that, so Andreas and Johannes, I challenged our listeners somewhat to a drinking game anytime Andy would mention Keptn, because invariably at the end of every episode, he'd be like, oh, and Keptn, plugging away because he loves it, but I just thought it was humorous. Now, though, we've done a couple of episodes on Keptn throughout the last year or so. I think this is a really nice in-depth one. I think what I learned the best is that whenever you're starting a project, don't be dogmatic about continuing to use what you started with. You have to be flexible and be willing to change. Look at, and I think this goes for any development project. I think this goes for anything in life, really, right? What is the goal that you're trying to achieve and where are you trying to get to? And you're going to start out by picking some tools, some frameworks, some anything to accomplish that. If you're going to be successful, though, you always have to ask yourself, what is the actual goal here? And is this approach and what I'm using helping me get there? And if not, abandon it now and find something else that will get you forward. The point is not to use Knative. The point is not to use necessarily even Kubernetes. The point is to get to an end state. And if you focus on that, the rest will fill itself in, and you might have some trials that you have to go through to find the right things. But that should be the goal. Even, speaking of our customers, right? Their customers are the goal, right? The goal is not to get into a microservices, containerized, highly scalable platform. The goal is to develop or is to deliver the best experience for your customers. And if that means microservices and Kubernetes, then great. If the monolith is doing it perfectly fine and you can improve upon that, great. So always keep that end goal in mind and don't be inflexible. That's my takeaways.
Very cool. Hey guys, thank you so much for getting on the show. I think it was the first time for both of you, and it's also new, kind of just talking into a microphone is not always that easy, but I think you were perfect guests because you have a lot of experience that you built up over the last year and a half. And I wish you all the best with Keptn and the path that is still ahead of us. And I'm pretty sure we will do great things here and make an impact. And hopefully we'll also grow the community more and more so that more and more people contribute, grows faster, and everybody's happy in the end, and then it's world peace and everybody's happy.
And people can find out more about Keptn on keptn.sh. Now, one thing, I don't know if it's still a problem, but I know some people were blocked from the site because of the .sh extension, which might be another lesson learned for you all. I don't know if that's still widespread. Right. Any other resources they should look at besides obviously Keptn.sh, and there's tons of great tutorials on there. You have on Keptn.sh, you'll find there's a Slack channel if you want to get involved and interact with people like Johannes and Andy and Andreas. There are some meetings you can get on to as well, bi-weekly meetings, a Twitter channel. It's all on there. We'll put links to all the stuff in the description. Anything else that people should look at for resources online, or is that the bulk of it?
I think that's a good start, to be honest with you. And then go to GitHub and star us and contribute. That would be great.
All right. Thank you both for coming on the show. Anybody has any questions, comments, you can reach us at pure_DT on Twitter. You can also send us an old-fashioned email at pureperformance@dynatrace.com. I just didn't know if it was pure_ is the pure DT. Yeah, pureperformance@dynatrace.com. If you have ideas for the show or you think you might want to be a guest, please reach out. And thank you all for listening. We really, really appreciate being able to do this. I know Andy and I learned so much by doing the podcast, and it's because you all keep listening that we get to keep doing this. So we really thank our listeners a lot. And last but not least, big thanks to Johannes and Andreas for coming on and sharing this and then giving a really great overview and history lesson on Keptn, because it's really fun stuff. So thank you.
Yeah, we have to say thanks for giving us the chance to talk and to also share our learnings on Keptn.
Thank you also from my side, and it was an honor.
Well, thank you. Until next time, we'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.